September 1st, 2025 marks the 120th anniversary of the creation of the province of Alberta. In recognition of this, I've collected a few mysteries from the province's history. From missing people and aircraft to an unsolved shooting and a lost hoard of gold, these are just some of the mysteries from Alberta history. Daniel Riley was born on November 28, 1860, in the town of Baltic, on the tiny future Canadian province of Prince Edward Island. As an adult, he would travel west to work for the Canadian Pacific Railway in Winnipeg. He would then follow the rails west to what was then the District of Alberta, located within the vast Northwest Territory. He settled into a life of ranching near the town of High River. He would grow to become a successful rancher. As the Northwest Territory was carved up to form the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, Riley would involve himself in the new province's politics. He would briefly serve as the mayor of High River in 1906. Riley would run in the 1917 Alberta provincial election in the High River electoral district, narrowly losing to the incumbent. His big break would come in 1926 when Prime Minister William Mackenzie King appointed Riley to the Canadian Senate. He would continue to serve in the Senate until his death in 1948. Riley was remembered as a successful rancher who had been an innovator and founding member and president of the Western Stock Growers Association. This would not be what Senator Riley was best remembered for, however. In 1946, he would have a rather extraordinary tale published. The following story has been presented many times, but with drastically differing details. The tale lies somewhere between the realms of folklore and reality. In order to keep this section of the video from becoming too long, I'll focus solely on the version of the story told by Senator Riley. The story begins in Tobacco Plains, Montana, during the spring of 1870. A group of men departed for a journey into the Northwest Territory. The men were prospectors, heading for the North Saskatchewan River to look for gold. Among their number were two men, known only as Lemon and Blackjack. Both were experienced and competent gold prospectors. The group successfully reached the North Saskatchewan River and found some gold, but not enough to call the expedition a success. The group made their way back south by the foothills of the Rocky Mountains that fall. Most of the group was headed for Fort Standoff, while Lemon and Blackjack were returning to Tobacco Plains. They would split from the group, taking the opportunity to do some of their own prospecting. During their travels, they would head into the mountains, following the Highwood River. The pair would discover promising signs of gold while panning the river. Following this lead, they would discover a vast deposit of gold. They would spend the rest of the day celebrating the discovery that would make them rich. Come evening, they would come to a disagreement on what their next move should be. Lemon wanted to remain at the site for a while longer, gathering gold, while Blackjack wished to immediately leave with what they already had, stake the claim, and return in the spring. This disagreement would escalate to the point where the two men nearly started attacking each other. They would eventually calm down and go to bed for the night. Blackjack would fall asleep while Lemon stayed awake, fuming at his partner. Eventually, once he knew Blackjack was asleep, Lemon quietly got up, grabbed an axe, and killed Blackjack with a single blow to the head. Lemon almost immediately regretted his actions. He would spend the rest of the night in a panic, building a great fire, pacing back and forth with his gun until sunrise as he could hear moaning and other strange and disturbing noises emanating from the surrounding forests. As soon as it was bright enough to travel, Lemon got on his horse, leaving the equipment and other horses behind with the remains of Blackjack. Unbeknownst to Lemon, the noises he had heard during the night did not come from the ghost of Blackjack, nor were they a figment of his imagination. As the men had made their way up along the Highwood River, they had followed an old trail used by local natives. The pair had believed they were alone in the mountains, but two young men from the Stoney Nation, named William and Daniel Bendo, had seen the men and quietly followed them for part of the journey, watching as the pair found gold, fought one another, and eventually witnessed the murder of Blackjack. The strange sounds that had horrified Lemon during the night were produced by the two Stoney men, seeking to further torment Lemon after his heinous act. After he had left the scene of the crime, the pair gathered the valuable equipment he left behind before taking the two remaining horses. As Lemon raced south to Tobacco Plains, the Bendos raced north to Morley, where their chief, Joseph Bearspaw, lived. On arriving at Tobacco Plains, Lemon confessed his crime to a priest he was friendly with. At this point, Lemon was described as half-crazed. As part of his confession, he would show the priest the gold that he had taken with him. The priest would tell John McDougall, an experienced mountain man, to go to the site indicated by Lemon and bury Blackjack. McDougall would successfully locate the site and the body of Blackjack. He would be buried by McDougall, who then covered the grave in a mound of stones. Meanwhile, the Bendos returned to Morley and told Chief Bearspaw of what they had seen. He swore the pair to secrecy, as Bearspaw did not wish to see a gold rush in the region. Upon learning of McDougall's expedition to bury Blackjack, Chief Bearspaw directed William and Daniel to take down the mound, disperse the stones, and eliminate any remaining trace of the prospector's discovery to prevent anyone else from returning. During the winter, Lemon seemed to recover somewhat from his guilt over murdering Blackjack. The other men wintering in and around Tobacco Plains heard of Lemon's discovery and persuaded him to lead an expedition back to the site in the spring of 1871. He was initially joined by 12 other men, but a vast number of fortune seekers would accompany them back to Lemon's mine. Lemon successfully led the group, which now numbered as high as 75, to within 6 miles of his mother lode. Lemon attempted to lead some of the men up to the site, but was unable to find his way. He would begin to act erratically and fled back to the camp when the other men threatened to lynch him, as they believed that this was a deliberate attempt to hide the gold from them. The group would eventually return to Montana empty-handed. In 1872, the priest who Lemon had confessed to organized another search party. This party would be led by John McDougall. The expedition faced a problem, however. McDougall was willing to lead the expedition but was in Fort Benton, 350 kilometers southeast of Tobacco Plains. It was decided that the party from Tobacco Plains would travel to Crow's Nest Lake and camp there until McDougall arrived. From there, the skilled mountain man would lead them to the fortune sitting in the Rockies. As McDougall made his way to Crow's Nest Lake, he made a stop at Fort Kipp. Fort Kipp was one of the many whiskey forts dotting the region at that time, and McDougall decided to partake in its wares, so to say. To say that he would overindulge is an understatement, as he would drink himself to death there. Thus, without McDougall, the 1872 expedition came to an abrupt end. In 1873, another expedition would leave for the Lost Lemon Mine, only to be turned back at Crow's Nest Lake by a wildfire. In 1874, Lemon would return to lead another expedition, only to go mad again as the expedition neared the site. Lemon would never recover from the guilt of his actions and would spend the rest of his days on his brother's ranch in Texas. This would mark the end of organized searches for the Lost Lemon Mine. A number of individual prospectors would try their luck, but all would fail. Among their numbers, and perhaps the most determined of them all, was Lafayette French. He had spent many years working as a rancher and trader in the High River region, spending much of his time looking for the lost gold. In 1884, he would become a government agent at the Stony Reservation at Morley. French had specifically sought this job out, as he knew the Stony had detailed knowledge of the gold's location. One year, while searching the mountains alone, French would be struck down by illness. He would barely make it to the ranch belonging to Daniel Riley. French would stay at Riley's ranch over the winter while he recovered. During his stay, he would tell Riley of the Lost Lemon Mine and show him a map that was supposedly created by Lemon. Riley would be fascinated by the tale and would accompany French on some of his future expeditions. One winter, another prospector named John Lee had allowed a group of men, including William Bendo, to spend the winter at his ranch. By chance, French had stopped there as well. Come spring, the pair offered Bendo 25 horses and 25 cattle in exchange for him agreeing to break his oath and lead them to the goal. Bendo initially agreed, but on the second day of the expedition, he was overcome by guilt over breaking his oath and refused to go any further. In 1912, French was able to make another deal with William Bendo. Bendo agreed to camp at an abandoned ranch near High River with French until Riley and another man named George Emerson could join them. That night, Bendo would die in his sleep. Other Stonies would come to collect his body and take it back to Morley to be buried. On the night of their arrival, Bendo's son-in-law would die under similar circumstances. Undeterred, French decided to carry out the expedition on his own. Sometime later, he would return to civilization. He would arrive at the Bayou Ranch and excitedly post a letter to a friend in Fort Benton. In the letter, French said that he had found the Lost Lemon Mine and that he would set off for High River come morning. He would then spend the night in an old cabin nearby. During the night, the cabin would mysteriously catch fire, severely wounding French. He would crawl to a nearby ranch, and from there he was quickly taken to the nearest hospital, located in High River. Upon his arrival, French, who was barely clinging to life, requested to speak with Riley. He had told Riley that he had finally found the gold, but was too weak to tell him any more. French promised to tell Riley in the morning, but would die in his sleep that night. According to Senator Riley, there may have been others to meet similar fates. A skeleton was supposedly found somewhere along the Old Man River, clutching a bag full of gold. Another story tells of a pair of badly wounded men carrying gold dust fleeing from the mountains in the 1890s. They spent the night at a ranch in the foothills, apparently failing to tell the residents of how they had become injured or acquired the gold. They set off for Fort Macleod the following day, but never arrived and were apparently never seen again. Geologists studying the region have not been able to confirm or deny the possibility of large gold deposits being formed in the area. At the very least, it's considered possible for there to be some precious metals in an area located between Crow's Nest Lake and Mist Mountain. After the death of French, there was still some effort to search for the Lost Lemon Mine. In 1949, construction crews building Highway 40 between Morley and Coleman would report that they had discovered the mine, but this turned out to be a false alarm. Around the same time, another mine was constructed in the area. The town of Kovac, also referred to as Ribbon Creek, was constructed in 1947 to serve a mine. This mine was looking for coal instead of gold, and it can be safely concluded that the mine failed to turn up anything other than coal, as it would only operate for 5 years, shutting down in 1952. As of 2025, the Lost Lemon Mine has never been found, and there's still reasonable doubt as to whether it ever existed at all. Emilio Picariello was born in the late 1870s in either Sicily or east of Naples. In 1899, he would leave his homeland for Toronto. Through hard work, he would buy an Italian grocery store, marry, and start a family. In 1911, he decided to move west to Fernie, British Columbia. He would repeat his success in Toronto here as well. He would work in a macaroni factory until the owner moved to Lethbridge. Picariello would rent the factory and begin building his own empire in the Eastern Rockies. He would move into the alcohol and ice cream industries, establishing a local monopoly by 1916. He originally sold the ice cream from a wagon, but would open ice cream parlors in Blairmore and Trail by 1917. Instead of regular payment, he would occasionally take payments for the ice cream in the form of empty bottles, which he would then sell to bottlers in BC at a profit. This would earn him the nickname of the Bottle King. In 1916, another lucrative business opportunity would open up. Even before the nation of Canada was formed, the temperance movement sought to ban the sale of alcohol. As the movement gathered strength throughout the late 1800s, they would attempt to force the Canadian government to submit to their demands. In 1898, a national plebiscite was held on whether to ban the sale of liquor in the country. The temperance movement would just barely win, only for Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier to declare that such a narrow victory was insufficient for this contentious issue. The temperance movement did have an alternative solution. A previous law from 1878 gave individual counties and municipalities the power to ban the sale of alcohol within their own jurisdictions. Provincial and territorial governments were also capable of enacting their own bans. During the early 1900s, these avenues would be used by the temperance movement to enforce their morality across the nation. Starting in 1901 with Prince Edward Island, prohibition would creep its way across Canada. It would be pushed further as the First World War broke out. In 1916, the province of Alberta would enact prohibition. Due to the complicated mess of regulations and jurisdictional issues between the federal and provincial governments, no bans on importation from outside of Alberta were enacted at this time. This meant that somebody located just outside of Alberta in a wet province, who already had close connections to the brewing industry and a business empire that crossed the border into Alberta, stood to make a tremendous and perfectly legal profit. Picariello would waste no time in seizing the opportunity, transporting alcohol to Blairmore in a small fleet of Ford Model Ts. His task would become harder in 1917, as British Columbia would also enact prohibition. Picariello would innovate, finding ways of continuing the business outside the confines of the law. His actions were known to the Alberta Provincial Police, who would continue to try and fail to shut down his operation. As one example, he would load his cars with bags labeled as containing flour. The exterior bags that were most likely to be searched if the police stopped the car contained flour just as advertised. Hidden deep within the shipment, however, lay bags containing alcohol instead. Upon arriving at their destination, the bags containing flour were given away to the poorer families of the region, ensuring that Picariello would remain popular amongst the people. He would become an alderman in Blairmore, even though his smuggling was an open secret in the region. Picariello was able to replace the Ford Model Ts with McLaughlin's. Picariello would participate in some of the smuggling runs himself, but would leave most of the runs to other drivers in his employment. Among those employed by Picariello in 1922 were his 16-year-old son Stefano and a woman named Florence Lissandro. Lissandro was another Italian immigrant who had moved west to British Columbia. She was married to Charles Lissandro, who officially worked for Picariello as the manager of the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore, one of the Bottle King's properties, which naturally was also involved in his smuggling activities. Florence was hired as a waitress for a time, but would eventually involve herself in the smuggling operation as well. She would participate in the transport of alcohol through the Crow's Nest Pass. On some occasions, she would accompany Stefano in a decoy car to check for APP patrols, posing as a young couple to avoid suspicion. Other times, she would drive the alcohol herself. Lissandro's marriage to Charles was troubled, and it's rumored that she was having an affair with either Emilio or Stefano, though this has never been confirmed. A relationship like this may explain later events, however. In the spring of 1922, the Alberta Provincial Police would hire former Fernie Chief of Police, Stephen Lawson. It is unclear if he had any prior dealings with Picariello and his operation, though given Picariello's prominence in the region, this may be the case. Constable Lawson would be stationed in Coleman, the nearest town to the BC border located in the Crow's Nest Pass. By this point, the APP was getting desperate to bring firm charges against Picariello and shut down his empire. Up to this point, the most they had managed to do was issue a few fines. This was hardly enough to bring down the Bottle King. Fortunately for the police, they had some unlikely allies. Picariello's success had created a great deal of envy and animosity amongst the lesser bootleggers his empire had left in the dust. Two such men were Jack Wilson of Fernie and Mark Rogers of Lethbridge. Together with the Alberta Provincial Police, they would concoct a sting operation intended to finally bring down their mutual enemy. The scheme would start in September of 1922, as Rogers ordered a shipment of alcohol. In order to complete the order, Picariello sent 3 cars east on September 21st. One was driven by his mechanic, J.J. McAlpine, one by Stefano, and the third was driven by Picariello himself. The next part of the plot occurred when the trio drove through Coleman. Lawson was watching for the men and sent word to his colleagues in Blairmore when they drove past him. Upon their arrival at the Alberta Hotel, a pair of Alberta Provincial Police constables approached the men and presented a search warrant. At this point, however, their plan began to fall apart. Picariello immediately signaled his son to turn around and race back to BC. He then positioned his car to block the constables from chasing Stefano. A frantic message was sent to Lawson in Coleman to stop Stefano before he could make it back across the border. Lawson would stand by the road with his gun. When Stefano approached, Lawson fired a warning shot into the air. When this was ignored, he aimed for Stefano instead, though only succeeded in hitting his hand. Despite his injury, Stefano was still able to keep driving. Using a commandeered car, Lawson pursued Stefano until he popped a tire and was forced to watch as the injured Stefano fled back to BC. With the scheme to bring him down defeated, Picariello made his way towards the border. Passing through Coleman, Lawson would speak to him, telling him to bring Stefano back across the border to face charges. After this, Picariello would decide to return to Blairmore, where he spoke with one of the constables who had tried to catch him in the act. He would taunt the constable before mentioning that Lawson was lucky, as Picariello would have killed him if he had injured Stefano. Picariello was unaware of the fact that Lawson had injured Stefano. He would soon find out, however, and set out for Coleman to confront Lawson. He would be joined by Florence Lissandro. He would pull his car up to the APP barracks in Coleman, where Lawson lived with his family. Lawson would approach the car and the trio would speak. The exact details of what happened next are unclear. The conversation started off in a civil manner, but would for some reason escalate. Picariello and Lawson would begin a physical altercation while Picariello was still in his car. The altercation would end when 4 to 6 gunshots were heard and Constable Lawson would stumble away from the car, seriously injured. Picariello and Lissandro would flee the scene. Only one bullet would actually hit Constable Lawson, but it would be a fatal shot. The 2 bootleggers would be apprehended soon after and were charged with the constable's murder. When the trial began in Calgary that November, it was clear that no one knew who exactly had shot Constable Lawson. As part of their defense, Picariello and Lissandro would be tried together, claiming that Lawson had attacked them and had been shot in self-defense. Given the previous threat made by Picariello, this was not particularly convincing. Still, no witnesses were able to identify who had shot Lawson, and neither were confessing to the crime. As only a single bullet had actually struck and killed Lawson, this meant that only one of them could actually be guilty of the murder. The shooting was witnessed by Lawson's 9-year-old daughter, who was standing nearby when he was shot. She was unfortunately unable to give any clear testimony as to who had shot him, pointing to both Picariello and Lissandro as being the culprits and generally giving contradicting testimony. One theory suggested that Picariello had come to Lawson to request assistance in locating his injured son. When Lawson refused, Picariello attempted to pull a gun on him. Lawson saw this and attacked Picariello, trying to get control of the gun. Lawson soon appeared to be winning, putting his hands around Picariello's neck. At this point, Lissandro intervened, pulled out her own gun, and shot Lawson. Another theory suggested that Lawson had been shot by Picariello when he tried to flee from the car during the altercation. Some, including Picariello and Lissandro, claimed that the shots came from outside of the car. It was claimed that the real shooter had been lurking in a nearby alley. Who this supposed shooter was would not be explained. Supposedly, some evidence for this otherwise unlikely theory existed. Glass from the car was found broken inside the vehicle's floor, which supposedly could only have been found there if the shots came from outside of the car. In the end, the court would come to a simple, effective, and legally questionable conclusion to the case. Both would be found guilty of Lawson's murder and were sentenced to death. The pair's attempt to appeal the decision failed, and both would be executed on May 3rd, 1923 at Fort Saskatchewan. Both would plead their innocence until the end. Florence Lissandro is the only woman to ever be executed in the province of Alberta. The saga would be one of the final nails in the coffin of Alberta's Prohibition era. Though support was already waning by 1923, the case would further reduce support to the point where the provincial government would soon end Prohibition. Like any other populated area, Alberta has been home to many missing persons cases. For this video, I decided to take a closer look at 2 cases that unfolded in the mid-1970s, half a century ago. In October of 1974, 27-year-old William Bereziuk left Edmonton for a canoe trip down the Athabasca River. He planned to spend the winter in the Birch Mountain area before returning to civilization in August of 1975. He would never return from his trip. On May 18, 1975, Canadian Armed Forces members would recover some of his equipment from the shores of an island in the Athabasca River. This island is not identified in the RCMP case reference, but was apparently located approximately 50 kilometers north of Fort McMurray. It appears as though his belongings had washed up on the island rather than having been deliberately placed there. Thus concludes the available information for the disappearance of William Bereziuk. or at least that which is publicly available that I could find in short order. All information in the case comes from a very brief RCMP case reference. This reference is quite barren of information. What equipment Bereziuk had brought with him for his trip is not detailed, only a list of clothing and jewelry that he was last seen wearing. The equipment found on the island or its condition is also not detailed. Looking at a possible route taken by Bereziuk reveals a few potentially interesting details. The Athabasca River is not located in Edmonton. The nearest the river gets to Edmonton is at the aptly named town of Athabasca, located about 130 kilometers north of Edmonton city center. It is not said where Bereziuk began his journey, though Athabasca seems to be a credible candidate. Besides being the nearest spot to Edmonton, the town is easily reached via Highway 2. Given that Bereziuk would have needed to bring a substantial amount of equipment to the river from Edmonton, he either would have needed to drive there himself or with the assistance of someone else. Either possibility could provide some useful information, but no further details are provided in this regard. The Athabasca River flows in a broadly northeasterly direction until reaching Lake Athabasca, located on the northern part of the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's also unclear where Bereziuk intended to end his journey or where he intended to spend the winter in the Birch Mountain area. It's possible that this is unknown because Bereziuk did not inform anyone. The first 40 kilometers of the route along the river passes near populated farmland. East of the bridge carrying Township Road 690 over the river, however, lies nothing but wilderness until reaching Fort McMurray, approximately 220 kilometers away as the crow flies and 400 kilometers by river. Presumably, Bereziuk met his end somewhere between these points. The discovery of his equipment washed up on an island downriver suggests that he suffered some sort of accident while canoeing down the river, either before or after his winter stay in the Birch Mountain area. Though the exact location of the recovered equipment is not given, Alexander Island, located approximately 50 kilometers north of Fort McMurray, seems a credible candidate. It is stated that the equipment was found by Canadian Armed Forces members. This may suggest that some sort of search was underway by May of 1975. Since Bereziuk did not intend to return until August, then, if we combine the presence of soldiers possibly looking for him with the date of the discovery, this would imply that there was already some concern for his well-being by this point. It is not said if the equipment had washed up recently or whether it had appeared to have been sitting there for some time. Ultimately, the disappearance of William Bereziuk remains unsolved. 50 years later, though, the small amount of available evidence would suggest that his demise was the result of an accident rather than foul play. A few weeks after the discovery of William Bereziuk's belongings near Fort McMurray, another mystery would unfold in the south of the province. Specifically, this story starts in Coleman, the very same town in which Constable Stephen Lawson had been murdered a little over 50 years prior. In the years since the constable's death, the Crow's Nest Pass had declined along with the coal mining industry that had initially fueled its development. Most mining activity in the region had ceased in the 1950s and 60s, with the notable exception of Coleman, where mining continued until 1983. Among the town's residents was a man named Edward Joseph Arcand. Like Bereziuk, no information about him is available on the internet apart from his disappearance, at least none that I could find easily. What is known is that on June 8, 1975, Arcand left his home in his 1969 Ford Falcon. What the purpose of his trip was or where he was going is not reported, assuming anyone else knew at all. He would never be seen again. Arcand's Falcon would be found abandoned on June 15th. It was located 80 kilometers north of Coleman on Highway 40 and appears to have been the only clue found in the case. In 1977, an unidentified man's remains were found inside a septic tank located near Toefield. It was briefly considered that this unidentified murder victim could be Arcand, but analysis of dental records disproved this. Arcand was missing 6 teeth and had 3 fillings, while the unidentified man in Toefield's teeth were intact. He would later be identified as Gordon Sanderson in 2021, who had gone missing after leaving his home in Edmonton for a trip to Calgary. Returning to Highway 40, there is no information on what state Ford Falcon was in when it was found, simply that it was located on Highway 40. Whether the car was functional when it was found is not said, nor is it stated whether the vehicle was sitting on the road, parked beside the road, or had crashed or got stuck. It's also not indicated if any signs of foul play were found. A more detailed description of the car upon its discovery on June 15th would have been helpful. This does lead us to another issue, that being the question of where Arcand was going. Arcand was a resident of Coleman and was headed north somewhere. Before going into any further discussion, we should discuss Highway 40 itself. This highway runs between the towns of Coleman and the Morley area, passing through remote mountain valleys for approximately 210 kilometers. The northern half of the highway is referred to as the Kananaskis Trail and is paved in the present day. The southern half of the highway is unpaved. The halfway point is located around Highwood Junction. Driving north around Coleman, then, upon reaching Highwood Junction, a motorist would need to turn left to go north towards Morley, or go right to leave Highway 40 and instead take Highway 541 east to Longview. In the present day, a service station is located at the junction, one of only a few traces of human habitation in the area. Arcand would not reach Highwood Junction, with his car being found 25 kilometers south. It would appear that he intended to take the road, as two unpaved roads connect Highway 40 to the paved and busier Highway 22, located a little more than 20 kilometers to the east. The nearest of the roads to where his Falcon was found is Highway 532, which is located about 7 kilometers behind the location of the Ford Falcon. The location of 80 kilometers north of Coleman is likely an approximation. Nevertheless, if this approximation is to be believed, the car was found just west of Plateau Mountain. The area is devoid of permanent settlement, like the rest of the highway, with few exceptions. Near this point is the start of Plateau Mountain Road, which, as the name implies, leads to the summit of Plateau Mountain, around 1,700 feet above. It should also be noted that not all roads in the area are open year-round in the present day. Many of these remote mountain roads are closed during the winter. They are also closed for the benefit of wildlife to allow them to find food after the winter. I noticed 3 such closed roads during this time of year. The section of Highway 40 extending between Highwood Junction and the Kananaskis Lakes is closed between December 1st and June 15th. Highway 532 is also closed until June 15th. Perhaps most interestingly of all, a gate on Highway 40 is found 80 kilometers north of Coleman, in the area where the Falcon was found. The Google Street View image of the gate is quite blurry, so I can't make out when the road reopens. Any assumptions based on these gates are flawed, however, as I have no idea whether they existed in 1975, or if they did, what opening dates were set. It's also not known where Arcand was going. Based on some of my own familiarity with the region, I can see some possibilities. If Arcand wanted to reach Calgary, the nearest major city, then Highway 40 would be a possible route from Coleman, with Arcand leaving Highway 40 at some point, either taking Highway 541 or the Trans-Canada Highway East. The issue with this possibility is that this would not be the ideal route. It would be much faster to drive east from Coleman to Highway 22 and head to Calgary from there. There are a few other possible destinations. Arcand is listed as Indigenous on his case reference file, though no specifics are provided. Looking at the area surrounding Highway 40, there are a couple of reserves near the route. Turning east onto Highway 541 at Highwood Junction would lead to a reservation at Eden Valley. Alternatively, a reservation at Morley would be a direct route along Highway 40 until reaching the Trans-Canada Highway. While researching this case, I also found that the Alexander First Nation, located northwest of Edmonton, has a long string of chiefs with the last name Arcand, indicating the presence of a prominent Arcand family there. This theory has the same issues as the Calgary theory, as an easterly route up Highway 22 to Calgary, then following Highway 2 north would be faster than traveling on Highway 40. It's also possible that Arcand had no intention of traveling to any town or city, and his journey was purely recreational. A number of campsites and hiking trails are located along the picturesque route. By a lucky coincidence, I visited the Kananaskis area on July 8, 2025, exactly 50 years and 1 month after Arcand was last seen. Though I didn't go any further south than Highwood Junction, I can see why someone would want to visit the area. Whatever brought Edward Arcand to Highway 40, the mystery of his disappearance remains unsolved over 50 years later. Returning to the subject of aviation mysteries, the main fare of this channel, Alberta is not exactly a hotbed for such things. Much of the province is home to vast farmland, not the sort of terrain in which aircraft go missing. The north and southwest of the province are another matter. The north is sparsely populated and heavily forested, while the southwest is home to a part of the Rocky Mountains and their foothills. This latter area is where we will focus our attention. On December 23, 1978, Chet and Betty Talbot would leave Indian Head, Saskatchewan with their son Sheldon to spend Christmas at 108 Mile Ranch in British Columbia with their daughter. They would hire Art Underwood, an experienced pilot, to take them to Kamloops, from where they would drive to 108 Mile Ranch. Weather in the region was poor, forcing Underwood to land his Cessna 185 Skywagon, registered Charlie Golf Charlie Zulu Hotel, at Red Deer during the evening of the 23rd. They would be forced to stay in Red Deer overnight. On the 24th, they would leave Red Deer for Kamloops. The aircraft and its occupants would never be seen again. A 2-week-long search based out of Edmonton would spend an approximate total of 1,100 flight hours searching for the aircraft, but would find nothing. One clue would come from the town of Rimbey, however. On the same day that the Talbots left Red Deer to spend Christmas in British Columbia, a 12-year-old boy named David Reynolds had already received a special Christmas present from his uncle. This present consisted of a pair of functional walkie-talkies discarded by an airlock. Reynolds lived in the town of Rimbey, located 50 kilometers northwest of Red Deer, and would soon start playing with them alongside his cousin Tracy. After playing with the devices for a while, a third voice would enter the conversation. This panicked voice identified herself as Betty Talbot and told the pair that the plane she had been traveling in had crashed and that some of the occupants were injured, possibly dead, and that she needed help. She told them that Sheldon was also alive. After talking to her for some time, the teenagers went to David's mother, who called the RCMP. The next day, the pair would hear from Betty Talbot again. This time, she informed them that Sheldon had died during the night and was angry about not being found. Nothing more would be heard from her. The RCMP would direct David's mother to listen for what Reynolds described as, quote, the black box beeping, end quote. This likely refers to the aircraft's emergency locator transmitter, or ELT. It would appear that the ELT aboard the Skywagon had failed to activate. The RCMP would later take the walkie-talkies as part of their investigation. It wouldn't be until 5 days after the crash that the RCMP would further investigate or follow up with the Reynolds. The search would end on January 9th, 1975, without finding any trace of the aircraft. In the mid-2010s, Reynolds would attempt to take a look at the case again. Very little information is available. As of 2014, he believed that the aircraft laid somewhere in the forested foothills west of Rimbey. Reynolds wished to search the area, but lacked the resources to make more than a couple of small trips. The area has become more developed and deforested in the years since 1978, narrowing down the search area, though despite this, no further updates have come from the case as far as I'm aware. On April 29, 1982, 5 men left Fox Creek in a recently purchased Cessna 185 Skywagon. The aircraft was flown by Daryl Trottier, who, like the other men, was involved in the oil field trucking industry. Their destination was Prince George, British Columbia, where a heavy equipment auction was about to be held. The Cessna, registered Charlie Golf Juliet Lima Juliet, would last be heard from at 6:48 a.m. when Trottier made a routine position report 54 nautical miles west of Fox Creek. During the brief report, he indicated he was flying at 10,000 feet over Smoky Tower, a nearby fire lookout. The aircraft would fail to arrive at Prince George. A 21,000 square mile area was searched by both civilian and military searchers. Most of the territory searched is mountainous and/or forested. Despite the best efforts of both, no trace of the aircraft was found. A few potential clues were found as to what might have caused the crash. The aircraft was apparently having issues with its fuel tank shortly before its final flight. According to those familiar with the ATC recordings of Lima Juliet's final flight, a brief communication was made from the aircraft at 6:14. This communication was unintentional, likely the result of Trottier's finger slipping onto the microphone. This indicated that the aircraft was encountering significant turbulence at this time. Trottier only had around 300 flight hours at the time of the accident. The strong turbulence could have caused the aircraft to break up. If the aircraft had hit the ground in pieces, wreckage would have been smaller and spread out over a wide area. Combined with the remote forested territory, this could have prevented searchers from finding the wreck. In July of 2004, a prospector working in the Monkman Pass in British Columbia found aircraft wreckage, but further analysis would reveal that the wreck belonged to a different aircraft which crashed in 1965. The region in which the aircraft crashed is remote, mountainous, and heavily forested, especially around the border between British Columbia and Alberta. Mountains in the region can exceed a height of 8,000 feet, though most are somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 feet. Typical terrain height around the mountains and foothills is roughly 5,000 feet above sea level. Apart from a few hiking trails and access roads, the region west of the last known position is untouched by regular human habitation, particularly towards the west. In April of 2021, the RCMP would issue a plea to any forestry workers or outdoorsmen in the area to be on the lookout for anything unusual regarding the plane. As of 2025, the Cessna Skywagon and its 5 occupants remain undiscovered. I hope you enjoyed learning about these mysteries from Alberta history. I made sure to find some more obscure ones to accompany the better-known mysteries. I had to rush this video slightly as the work on the second aircraft model I've been making took longer than intended. Fortunately, I've gotten that model finished and I'm currently in the process of printing it. I've already finished the printing for the first model. Once I'm finished with this video, I'll be moving on to finishing the design work on the next 2 models, which I should be working on when this video comes out. I'm optimistic that I will be able to get these 2 done in a shorter amount of time, leaving me a little more time to finish the next video. I'll see you then as I have some models to make.